And then I open this academic session in which Philip will defend the academic thesis called The European Union, Evidence in Medicine's Regulation and Legislation. Before we proceed, I would like to introduce, otherwise they're never named, the supervising team. That's Dr. Angela Brand, our full professor in public health genomics, and it's Dr. Timo Clemens, assistant professor in European public health of our university. Was not here, but very important, I think, in the process was Dr. Marisa Papalouka, scientific advisor in the European Medicines Agency. My name is none of the pro-rector today, but of course the middle of the center of our focus is on you. So I would like to give you the floor for a 15-minute summary of your work.
Thank you, Rector. Thank you, promoters. Thank you, opponents and friends and family for being here. My thesis was on the European Union evidence in medicines regulation and legislation. Before I start, I'll just explain the stained glass window because I know people are interested in that. It's evidence is changing from the traditional way increasingly towards artificial intelligence, and this was artificial intelligence generated image from DALI using the thesis title and stained glass as the prompt. I would love to say I had the foresight of including that because of the stained glass here, but I didn't, but it works nicely. So science has shifted from proclaiming certainty to probability, and the things that first appeared simple often in reality turned out to be much more complex and systems-based. If we think about our original perception of human anatomy was based on organs, and now it's really the sort of subcellular ecosystems that drive our anatomy. Similarly, our view of the world has changed from the molecular now to the probabilistic world of quantum mechanics. This challenges the translation of scientific evidence to policymaking, because policymakers like certainty, the electorate like certainty. On top of that, we're facing a world of increasing data and knowledge, and they're growing exponentially. Yet the structures that receive those data and knowledge and that make our decisions are based on structures that haven't changed really for hundreds of years. And so the policy-making mechanisms must keep up. But why must they keep up? And that's because uninformed, informed policy-making causes real harm. And to give the overused example of tobacco, we saw that first it was uninformed and then it was misinformed policy, and that caused an enormous amount of harm for the population, but it also caused weakening trust in the scientific disciplines that provided that evidence, and uninformed or misinformed policy also weakened citizens' trust in governments themselves. So with that background, my thesis took the European Union as an example of a modern and advanced governance structure and how it uses its evidence. I took case studies that I'll go through in medicines regulation, which in and of itself is a very advanced area in terms of evidence use. And it took those case studies to then finally come up with recommendations for improving the evidence use across the EU as a whole. And the first tool is horizon scanning, which is the systematic scanning of information sources to detect early trends and challenges to enable you as decision makers to respond to those trends and challenges. And so this is proliferating as a method across organizations, but no one had done a review of how people are doing this horizon scanning. So we conducted a systematic literature review to that effect and produced a map to inform organizations on how they should establish their own horizon scanning. For example, how others are identifying horizon scanning topics, searching the sources, how they're filtering, prioritizing these topics, and then how they're assessing the impact of those future trends and technologies. And this map was used by the European Medicines Agency to set up horizon scanning. It was used by other regulatory agencies across the world and to help the WHO set up their new strategic foresight unit. And we found it potentially a reliable tool to inform decision making, although there was little evidence on how the impact of horizon scanning to date on informing decision making, other than what's in this thesis, to be honest. So we then applied, that was the methods of horizon scanning. applied horizon scanning to look at new trends and technologies. And it became quite evident very quickly that there are a lot of course, knowledge gaps with these new trends and technologies. If you take genome editing as an example, it's unclear how best to measure the unintended effects of genome editing, where these editors are going to hit our genome off the target zone that we want them to. And so, as decision makers, I think it's important that we have access to research to answer those questions. And at the European Medicines Agency, they didn't have access, and regulators frequently don't have access to research, to researchers. And so we proposed a regulatory science research mechanism to do that, which we then implemented and produced 120 of these questions that we wanted, that the European Medicines Agency saw needing to be addressed. And that brings me to the broader point of, as I said, the importance of having this arm to research, to academia, to deliver those, to answer those questions. And so we've seen the application of horizon scanning, the need for for research to be conducted, and then we produced a stakeholder consultation, which I'll go into in a second, to produce the Medicines Agency Science Strategy to 2025. That was a response to what I've just previously mentioned, but also this growing complexity of innovation. The agency recognized the need to not only adapt to that innovation that's coming, change itself to be more agile, more future-proof to a world of quickening innovation through systematically implementing horizon scanning, through implementing that research agenda that I just demonstrated, through a number of other flagship initiatives such as clinical trial, multi-stakeholder platform to reform the EU's environment for clinical trials, providing resources and the infrastructure to use real-world evidence, real-world data, not in addition to clinical trial data in European Medicines Agency's decision-making. And this was for the public consultation that we conducted, we tried to make it as useful as possible for us and for stakeholders. And that reuse of it as a public good is sort of threefold. First is that we would try to be very transparent in how we use the results of this stakeholder consultation to amend and finalize the strategy. The second is that we published the raw data of the stakeholder consultation as well as the analysis as a resource for others who are interested in the future of medicine development and regulation. And finally, we published the method of the stakeholder consultation because it was, from an EU's perspective, comparatively rigorous, and so we wanted to be able to follow this methodology. And this is just an example slide that you can see, but for your information, the top sort of two areas stakeholders perceive as the most important in medicines development and regulation across the next 5-10 years was reforming that clinical trial landscape and using that real-world data in medicines development. And so those previous have been on tools to inform decision-making. It's not only important to get the right evidence to inform decision-making, it's also important to be transparent about how you come to those decisions, how you use that evidence. And here, this chapter is about the interface between how the European Medicines Agency provides rationale for its decisions to health technology assessment bodies. So the European Medicines Agency assesses the benefit-risk of medicines, and then, if positive, health technology assessment bodies determine their value. And they base that in large part on what the European Medicines Agency publishes about its decision. But those two sets of organizations haven't had much contact over the years, and so this piece of research was looking at how that interface can be improved, both in terms of the content, that's the contact, but also vision, the justification in written documents of how EMA came to its decision. And to give you an example of the differences where this lack of choice is a problem, you see comparator choice in clinical trials, i.e. the medicines that the patients are receiving. Often HTA bodies aren't happy with what EMA accepts. The endpoints or the measures that we take patients in clinical trials often there's a divergence between HTA bodies and EMA in terms of what they would like to see, and same with the target population, so who's included in clinical trials. There's often a difference. And so this paper came up with a series of recommendations to improve that interface. This is the final part of the thesis, and it's on broader recommendations for EU policymaking as a whole. The first part looked into the scientific advice and the use of evidence historically and at the present day in the EU's mainly legislative procedure, and came up with recommendations for improving that. For example, highly esteemed and esteemed opponents, if you produce research, you expect it to go under expert peer review as a minimum, but the evidence base that underpins the legislation affecting 400 million people doesn't undergo any sort of expert peer review. The second part builds on what I've presented previously in terms of the importance of evidence use, producing high quality and legitimate decisions, to come up with further recommendations for the EU and the concept of a European evidence ombudsman, provocative concept. And that was really, the idea was to take improving the use of evidence out from the political better regulation agenda and institutionalize it. But institutionalize it in a manner that's democratically accountable, so that the evidence ombudsman will be set up with a group across the EU institutions, but also ensure that how the EU improves its evidence use is proportionate, i.e. not over-burdensome for policymakers, doesn't restrict policymakers, but also that it ensures this balance between a technocracy and a political project that the European Union ultimately is. You don't want evidence to be a barrier to making decisions when decisions have to be made. And so, to conclude, the pace of scientific advancement and knowledge is quickening, and to keep up, the EU needs to reform. And so this thesis has looked at evidence use across EU policymaking, and specifically medicines regulation, to come up with recommendations. So we saw in the first chapter the importance of horizon scanning for making proactive decisions, and actually the results of applying those horizon scanning fed into the Commission's pharmaceutical strategy, and we asked for a regulatory sandbox to meet this quickening pace of change, and they've included that in the legislation now, so that was very positive to see. We've seen the importance of having access to research to not only ensure that the evidence you use is appropriate, but generate evidence to your questions as decision makers. We've seen the importance of using evidence in developing strategies with stakeholders and advancing the legitimacy of those strategies. The importance of stakeholder consultations and how they can be not only policymakers but act as a resource for wider society. The importance of communicating not only the evidence underpinning those decisions, but how and why you made those decisions. And finally, coming up with recommendations to...
And thank you for this presentation. We'll now turn to the actual defense of your thesis. And the first question will be asked by the secretary of this committee, and that's Professor Pavlova. She's a professor of health economics and equity at the Department of International Health of our university. The floor is yours.
Dear candidate, my congratulations to you and to your supervisory team for this important dissertation. You have investigated a very relevant topic on how to use evidence in decision making, and also looking at different areas, specifically focusing on medicine regulations in Europe. I was impressed by the number of publications. So this indicates that your dissertation is relevant not only for policy and practice, as we also heard now, but also for research. So well done, and congratulations on this. I would like to discuss with you chapter 5, which is related to health technology assessment and also linked to my field of research. In this chapter, you focus on improving the evidence interface between decision makers, and specifically on connecting regulatory and HTA perspectives. And you use not one, but 3 methods of data collection in that chapter. So I was wondering, could you please explain why you needed to combine so many different methods of data collection? Why you do not, for example, just perform interviews, or why you do not choose 2? Why exactly those 3 methods?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. So the methods that we use was first to do a pairwise comparison between what's included in the European Medicines Agency's justification for its decision, its public assessment report as we call it, and what's included in Health Technologies Assessment's relative effectiveness assessment report, to see the difference in the sort of evidence that they include. And that gives you an idea. But then we wanted to hear what the academic literature and grey literature was saying about this interface between regulators and health technology assessment bodies. And so that's why we did the systematic literature review into this topic. But also, of course, literature isn't perfect and doesn't include many of the sort of political reasons, should we say, why interfaces aren't working. And that's why we wanted to supplement that with a series of interviews from regulators, but also health technologies assessment colleagues who were involved in that interface, to hear how it was going, how it's improved, and where it could improve in the future. And those 3 sources of information were what informed the recommendations that themselves then fed into the European Union's project to have a singular HTA initiative. So these recommendations fed directly into that, to improving that interface in the future.
Okay, thank you. So let me challenge you a little bit more on methodology. Would you describe your study as a mixed method study, or is it like a combination of 3 different studies? What do you think about it?
I would say it's mixed method, as I think it took all 3 elements combined to produce the recommendations.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, indeed, mixed method studies. We need to have some kind of synergy between the results to call them mixed method studies, and I totally agree with you. So let's now look a bit at the outcomes of this study, and specifically look at your results from the perspective of the HTA method and the limitations of it. As you most probably know, HTA method is very dependent on data availability. And if the data is lacking, we need to either make assumptions or look for data from other settings, which also means making assumptions. So can you explain to what extent you think that this issue is reflected in your recommendations in Chapter 5? So do you think that recommendations would be different if we consider the limitations of the HTA method?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think we tried to produce recommendations that were relevant to health technology assessment bodies that operate in that environment of sort of uncertainty and then have to make those assumptions that you mentioned. And the recommendations ultimately try and reduce that level of uncertainty that they're dealing with, so reduce the amount or the extent of the assumptions that they have to make. For example, one of the recommendations is that when developers come for scientific advice, so at an early stage of medicines development, they can come to the European Medicines Agency to receive advice on how they should go about generating their evidence, their clinical evidence, for example, is to include health technology assessment bodies at that phase more often, so that the evidence that they need, without which they'd have to make those assumptions, could be included in the development plan of those medicines. For example, health technology assessment bodies base a lot of their, or some of them base a lot of their evidence on patient, on quality of life data, and you can measure that in a clinical trial setting by inclusion of patient-reported outcomes and patient preferences. And so another of the recommendations of the report was that the European Medicines Agency and medicines regulators more broadly should include such endpoints in clinical trials. And finally, just another relevant recommendation to that, I think, is that conversation is important. And when you're having to make assumptions, it's good if you can validate those assumptions. And so it would be good if HTA bodies and regulators have that interface to have those conversations, which they have started to do, and which I know from the interviews with the health technology assessment bodies were particularly useful for them.
Yeah, thank you. I also think maybe you could add to those recommendations also another one, like making it possible to have more evidence on HTA, because in some EU member states such evidence is not available. So yeah, this would probably have made your recommendations complete. So let's us look at your findings in chapter 2, also from another perspective, and this is the equity. So this is a trend in the society and also in research and policy. More and more attention is paid to equity. And since HTA is a method that is focusing on efficiency, and efficiency sometimes contradicts equity criteria, you can think about developing medicines for rare diseases, for example. So given that, do you think, would you recommend for the future more or less use of evidence on HTA?
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for that question. It's a really interesting one, and we were actually discussing this last night. In terms of chapter 2, we produced 120 of these research needs, and that reflects the sort of interests or evidence areas of the European Medicines Agency. Many of those were in rare diseases, for example, or ATMPs, and this is a really good, a challenging topic, I think, because as medicines regulators globally actually have this focus on rare diseases, which is to put societal resources into diseases which affect the fewest members of society. So from an equity utilitarian perspective, it's, should we say, contrary, but from a perspective of ensuring that everyone has access to medicines, it's not. And so there's this inherent conflict. And the same can be said also from a European perspective and a US perspective as well, is that we have this focus on advanced therapies and answering the questions that the future, these advanced therapies, need to have addressed before they can reach patients, before they can reach the market. And these advanced therapies cost a lot of money, and ultimately then it's only the wealthier European countries often that can afford to have access to these medicines. So again, that's a sort of bias towards, an inequitable bias, I should say. I mean, on the flip side of that, the chapter 2, the research needs, go into some areas to try and improve equity, like ensuring that geriatrics are better included in clinical trials, or that maternal fetal health is better incorporated into patient populations in the clinical trials. So yeah, it's a difficult topic, and it's very interesting to see the opinion of regulators on that topic, because I think it's ultimately a value-based decision, but we have that value from the top down, from the EU level, and it's really globally. This is the case across regulators really around the world, that they focus on rare diseases.
Yeah, thank you very much for this discussion. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you, Professor Pavlova. I now turn to an external member of this committee. And we're always happy to have guests from abroad, because that attests to the importance of the topic and the work that you did. So I welcome Professor Anklam, and she is the former director of the Directorate General for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Please, your question.
Thank you very much. And I would also, first of all, congratulate you for the nice work. I did especially enjoy reading the recommendations. Before I have some practical questions about the European Evidence Ombudsman, I would like to dwell a bit more on general issues, like what we have definitions on health. Health is very important for the individual person. Can you just say in a few words what is What do you think? Is the definitions we have out there, or do we have a better definition on health? Is it ever possible to have it clearly?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your question. I mean, the definition of health, I think, is generally set or uses the WHO's one, which is sort of health and well-being rolled into one. In medicine's development, it's narrower, should we say, and it's usually tied to specific definitions of diseases, which causes some problems when it comes to the future of medicine's development. For example, we're expecting to see anti-aging therapies, which will be enhancement medicines, right? So they won't be necessarily combating a strict definition of disease. And so that poses a definitional and a legislative challenge as a result, because we have the mandate, the remit to approve medicines that address diseases. In the past, we've been able to sidestep this when we've needed to regulate contraceptives or even the sort of water that's used for injectables.
Okay, so it's difficult, anyway. What qualifications would your proposal was to set up this European Evidence Ombudsman? What qualifications would this panel need from each member state, a person? What qualifications do they have to bring in?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the good question. So the Evidence Ombudsman would have to have a core small secretariat, and I think that secretariat would, by definition, have to be multidisciplinary. And in the chapter, I propose that it's staffed via, it will have a core staff that are permanent, multidisciplinary core staff, but it can also be staffed via secondments from, for instance, the Joint Research Centre or the DGs or the agencies, to ensure that it has staff who have this policy-making experience, so that they can produce recommendations that are actually practicable from the realities of a policymaker's perspective. And then when it gets topic specific, so if it's adjudicating on a specific piece of regulation, I think it would need to pull on the sort of 800 or more expert groups that the European Commission has, and even more at the agency level. So yeah, I think it would have to have a core staff that's multidisciplinary, and then have the flexibility to get in real experts, not only from the expert groups of the European Union and the agencies, but also pull on Europe's strength in academia. And we have the Association of Academies of Science, which could be used to pull from that academia to form those expert groups.
Again, it is a very broad group of scientists, experts, whose opinion will go into this whole process, but will we ever get a clear outcome from such broad consultations with stakeholders? What do you expect?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the question. I think the Evidence Ombudsman has sort of would have two main functions. Firstly, is improving the use of evidence in the EU as a whole. So that would be an ongoing project, sort of taking over what has been done in the better regulation, but also broadening it to the Parliament, to the Council, maybe even the agency. So that's a sort of future-proofing, improving the standards, improving the norms of evidence use as a whole. And then it would have the secondary main function of adjudicating on the use of evidence in specific cases. And those specific cases are indeed the very specific expertise that I think you hinted at. So if it's adjudicating on, for instance, we had and I included it in the thesis, the glyphosate debacle, where there was a lot of contention over the EFSA's and I think ECDC's opinion on the safety of glyphosate, which went contrary to what the World Health Organization had produced, and how EFSA had used evidence was very unclear. And really the root of the controversy is that stakeholders were extremely unhappy that there was a lack of transparency in how that came to that decision. And so, for instance, in that case, it could be that the Evidence Ombudsman would form an independent expert panel on glyphosate to act as an independent arbitrator, but also, back to the first side of the mechanism, would have hopefully by that point improved transparency and use of evidence in general, such that those political debacles don't happen.
You are a bit more optimistic than me, because it's still not clear. It's still not solved, glyphosate, as we know. Yeah. And we have many, many other examples where we have 600 toxicological studies and do not know the real outcome. So this goes to my next question. Will we ever get a clear, unbiased opinion from scientists? And can science be ever neutral, only evidence-based?
Thank you very much, esteemed opponent, for your question. I think that touches on what I started my presentation on, with regards to, that was nice, with regards to the fact that science is now increasingly operating probabilities, right? And so we've seen this particularly acutely with climate change and the International Panel on Climate Change that produce fantastic scientific summaries. I mean, possibly the best example of global science in the history of humanity, but that all they can produce is probabilities. You know, we believe it highly likely that CO2 is driving climate change, and that's caused a real issue for policymakers, particularly policymakers who have skeptical electorates, because the electorate can say, look, it's not certain, why are you trying to tax my SUV? So I think this probabilistic world that science has had to move into, is challenging. And your second question, I think, was on the bias behind science. I mean, science is designed to be unbiased, but as the sort of replication crisis has demonstrated, it's so hard to produce unbiased evidence. But I think still biased evidence is, the biased evidence that we are producing is better than operating under no evidence or using evidence incorrectly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. So if advice is not really tied to evidence, explain what else is needed. So how can this be guided then?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I should have clarified perhaps in the presentation that by evidence, I'm not just meaning the sort of quantitative or qualitative scientific evidence that everyone is used to. I'm also meaning the will of the electorate, the interests of stakeholders, and policymakers have to take into account a lot of different angles when they're coming to decisions, and that I think is a challenge for scientists to really understand why they're making decisions that sometimes run contrary to science, because ultimately they're political actors. They need to do what's in the interest of, in theory at least, their electorate, and that can and justifiably run contrary to the scientific basis. For instance, in genetically modified organisms, if the electorate doesn't want it, it's right that they're restricted in their use, for example, even though the science may say that it's safe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Anklam. I turn to another guest from abroad, and that is Dr. Hines. She is the Senior Regulatory Director for Clinical Trial Innovation and Digital Health of Roche Incorporated in Basel, Switzerland. Welcome.
Thank you, Prorector, and thank you, dear candidate. Congratulations for the work. I've seen the work happening. As in industry, we have been following very closely the regulatory science efforts from the EMA, and I have to say it's very impressive work and how the agency has really advanced in their thinking, and I know you have had a very big contribution to that, so congratulations. I want to pressure test a little bit some of the proposals in the practical sense as well. So my questions will go into that direction, but before I go there, I'm really interested in, we see that not many regulators or not many regions have actually applied regulatory science. So we see, of course, the US, we see Europe with the work that you have presented, and then we see individual efforts maybe in Australia, a little bit in Singapore, and UK starting to take its first steps. What would you recommend for other regions in the world in how they could apply this system? What did you learn from the experience and the work that you have done in this PhD? And I'm thinking within pharmaceutical and medicines development, but I'm also thinking beyond that. So any recommendations that you would have?
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your question. It's a really good one, and this was the second chapter indeed, was on the need for this regulatory science research and on the need for regulators themselves, who are at the coalface of regulatory science, to be able to direct that research. As you mentioned, it's sparsely done around the world and very sparsely done in Europe, at least in medicines development. Certainly in other areas, for instance, the Joint Research Centre, there's a lot more going on in like nanotechnology and things. And that's a problem. I mean, fortunately, research is global, right? And if it's published, the results are applicable to jurisdictions across the world. And so the FDA has been doing regulatory science research for years and has an enormous budget, huge budget, and collaborations with a number of leading universities, really established institutions within those leading universities of regulatory science research. So they've been having a great role in advancing regulatory science research, but that means they can advance it in the areas that are of interest to the US, and sometimes there's areas of interest in Europe that aren't of the US. So we've been driving biosimilars, which essentially generics of biological medicines, to try and bring the costs down, whereas that wasn't necessarily as much of an interest, at least in the US. So we're hoping that with the introduction of regulatory science research in Europe, that we'll be producing additional evidence to what the US is doing to provide a broader evidence base that then be able to be reused by regulators around the world, as you mentioned, that aren't necessarily producing their own regulatory science research. But I think it would be good to see other organizations, international organizations, drive for more regulatory science research. For example, the ICH, the International Council of Harmonization, that harmonizes regulatory standards globally, I'm sure has a lot of regulatory science research questions it would love to have answered that come out of those discussions. And so maybe an agenda at the international ICH level would also be useful. But of course, with research, it's all very much dependent on money. And from a European perspective, sadly, we've found it difficult to get a budget stream to produce this regulatory science research, although we're fortunate enough to have good interface with the European Commission's Research Directorate General. So some of those questions are being addressed within the European Union's research program, Horizon Europe. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. So going beyond with that topic, dear candidate, you produced 120 questions, if I remember correctly, in the regulatory science research needs. And you were just alluding to the importance of working well with academia. What has been, in your experience, the uptake from academia in actually starting to work on those questions and producing answers? And how do we then make sure, which is also linked to the topic of your dissertation, that the results are taken up and implemented into legislation? So what's the role of regulators versus legislators there? And how can that work better?
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. In terms of working with academia, they've been very enthusiastic, of course, about research agendas. They're very positive, but then the follow-up question inevitably is, where's the money? And that's been a question we found difficult to answer, as I mentioned. We do, to try and address that, the European Medicines Agency established a fund to answer some regulatory science research questions, but that's only in the tens of millions, not the grand scale that perhaps would be required. Another approach that we found, therefore, is I established a collaborating expert scheme within the European Medicines Agency, which enabled us to in-house academics on temporary secondments to address some of these regulatory science research questions in the areas that they're interested in, so that would advance their postdoc or their PhD or their master's. So we've had 30 or 40 of them come in-house to deliver research, to deliver regulatory science research, and that's been quite successful. In terms of the feed-in of that research into regulation and legislation, again, one of the advantages, I suppose, of the regulator asking research questions itself is that it can directly translate the results of that research into new or updated guidelines for what developers should do, or into the scientific advice that it provides medicines developers So it's in a sort of unique position to ensure that the research results are actually translated into regulation, as regulators are the arbiter of that regulation. In terms of legislation, obviously legislation happens sporadically, but we fed a lot of the questions, or particularly from horizon scanning, a lot of things we saw coming into the Commission's proposal for the new sort of pharmaceutical legislation, which is a once-in-a-generational opportunity to revise the pharmaceutical system and to future-proof it to some extent. And we're happy to see the Commission provide us a legislative basis for the horizon scanning that I mentioned in the first chapter, and also that regulatory sandbox, which I mentioned previously. So again, from that's sort of the privileged position that European Medicines Agency is in to ensure the implementation of regulatory science research.
Thank you, dear candidate. Taking that one step farther, we now see shifts in, as you say, in evidence generation, in science, in medicine. We also see shifting roles for regulators in Europe with medical device bodies, with the European Medicines Agency, with HTAs. How can we ensure that we also not only implement small changes in the current system, but that we really think what is needed beyond? So I'm thinking even for extensions of indications, for example, shifting the responsibility down to payers or health technology assessment bodies. We see that already happening with off-label use in some countries. Maybe even regulators having a complete different role in the future, where direct access to data and real-time access to data is available for clinical trials, for example. So how do we ensure that what you're proposing also looks at challenging the current system and taking it far beyond small changes?
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. It's a really good question. And actually, it's something we're aware of, this lack of futures thinking, of deeper thinking into the structures of healthcare and healthcare regulation that need to change. And in fact, we've just finishing off with Camille in the audience an exercise looking at the future of digital health right through to 2050, so really far out stuff on how the health system could look and how the regulatory system could look. And one of the recommendations that might come out of that is this need to get health technology assessment bodies, payers, regulators, the Commission involved in an exercise to really think, okay, what should the future European health policy regulatory system landscape look like, so that if, for example, a two-speed Europe had the political go-ahead to move, there would be a vision of what that could look like for healthcare. So I think it's a really important point, and something that regulators, particularly at the European level, or the Commission, would be well placed to bring the stakeholders together to do that forward thinking, because it's definitely a gap.
Thank you very much, and I hand it back to the Prorector.
Thank you, thank you. I now turn to Professor Schmidt. He is our own professor of pharmacology and personalized medicine. The floor is yours.
First of all, congratulations to you and the supervisors for a very interesting piece of work. I'm more a wet lab scientist, and now recently started to do a lot of clinical trials, so I'm slowly appreciating the importance of regulatory science. Could I ask your paranymphs to read your stelling number 1?
So proposition number 1. Science and technology have advanced. Humans and their governance are lagging behind.
Thank you. You have mentioned we are moving from certainty to probability. I'm not so sure. I mean, if you look at the current requirements to get a drug approved, you have parameters that sound like certainty, power calculation, sample size calculation, statistical significance, and then you get a drug approved. But some of these drugs on the market have numbers needed to treat of 100, which means you need to treat 100 patients so that one will have a benefit. I would consider that pretty probabilistic therapy. So, and also methodologically, you use a systematic review, and I think in recent weeks, all of this has been a little bit superseded by GPT 3.5, GPT 4. Have you thought about that? I mean, we are making amazing discoveries how we can replace systematic reviews within a few seconds by GPT. Maybe your comments on that.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your timely comments and questions. In terms of the probabilities, I think your question almost alluded to it, the fact that in reality things are quite probabilistic. 1 in 100, we don't really know. Yet from a decision maker's perspective, we're still tied to this strict binary sort of certainty. We want to demonstrate a benefit risk. It is positive, but in reality, a benefit risk of a medicine might be negative for some patients, might be positive for others. It's a probabilistic game. So there's that tension, that conflict that is what I alluded to in the slide above, and thank you for mentioning it. And it's difficult as a medicines regulator to deal with those probabilities. With regards to your second question on artificial intelligence and the redundancy of some scientific methods like systematic literature reviews, I mean, I've already seen it applied to systematic literature reviews. Unfortunately, it came after I've drafted my thesis. And it's a shame that my paranemp can't answer this question because he works in artificial intelligence. But I understand GPT-4, and this is based on GPT-3, I think is extremely impressive.
Yeah.
And certainly for generative artificial intelligence.
I guess that it must have been AI.
Yeah. So for generating things where you can have room for errors, you see the parrot head is a bit messed up and the stained glass has got some bullet holes running through it. I didn't ask for that. It works wonderfully when it's creative, but when it comes to hard determinants of fact, of achieving this certainty that you mentioned, it doesn't do so well. And if you take the field of driverless cars, for example, I mean, they were supposed to be with us 6 years ago or more because people thought it would be simple to have artificial intelligence determine whether or not to take a left or right or brake or not. But in fact, it's faced the system again.
Can I add a question? I mean, your answer was a little bit, it's inevitable to have this probabilistic nature in our current principle. Patrick Vallance, the former CEO R&D from GSK, once gave an interview in Nature Review Drug Discovery. And he said the biggest problem that we in the moment have are our disease definitions. We hardly understand any disease. So once we will understand diseases, all diseases will basically split up into rare diseases, which is a connection what you mentioned on rare diseases. So once you actually have a precise molecular disease definitions like you have in monogenetic disease, then I think we will shift from probabilistic medicine to precision medicine. So what I actually predict is exactly the reverse that would happen.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that good point. And I'm wary that I may have overblown the fact that science is shifting from certainty to probability. Of course, in certain areas, there is binary certainty, whether it's something a yes or no. Merely that, as we've understood, the world is frequently, actually often based on systems, we've had to deal with probability. In terms of disease definition, that's a very good point, and that's something that this bias towards rare diseases, towards orphan medicines, struggles with and will struggle with in the future. And orphan medicines are not cheap, so the concept of them proliferating is expensive from a financial but also an equity perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I ask one of your paronyms to read the fifth stelling?
So number 5, the expert peer review is something academia considers crucial for the simplest of research, but which is missing from the evidence base of legislation affecting a block of 500 million people.
Thank you. So you make a big point about academic peer review, but you also mentioned that the reproducibility of published biomedical data or the irreproducibility is 60%. 60% of all biomedical data are not reproducible. And then when it comes to relevance, Ioannidis, from Stanford, has analyzed, he monitored 25,000 papers published in the top 6 journals. What had come out of them, I think 5 years later, 1 paper was tested clinically, was positive, and was licensed. So I think most of our academic research is irreproducible and definitely irrelevant. I mean, that's what the data say. So don't you think we need actually research on research rather than research on regulatory? Don't we think research on research first? Our false incentives at universities that we have to chase impact factors, grant money, PhD thesis.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that systemic question on academia.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think in the UK, you'll probably know more than me this, they've had a big initiative to revise the incentives of academia away from the application churn towards producing research that is useful for decision making and hopefully clarifying some of the research weaknesses that you've mentioned. From a medicine's regulatory perspective, of course, this is worrying, right? I mean, we're lucky to be operating frequently under the gold standards of randomized controlled trials that can then be easily meta-analyzed and stuff. So we're privileged to probably have a research that's slightly more robust than other fields, but there's still this need to move towards real-world data, towards how the medicines work in the clinic, in patients' homes, and in different patient population, to ensure, to do that almost replication in the real world, to ensure that initial evidence base is robust.
Okay.
Yeah.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you for evoking this identity crisis for every in the world. That's why I now turn to Dr. Franken. He's the Associate Professor of Pharmacology and Personalized Medicine, but also the CEO of a company called Digital Systems in Germany. Floor is yours.
First of all, thank you for the candidate. Apologies for not being with you in Maastricht, but therefore even more congrats to your work. I really love the idea of what you've been doing. I would like to focus on aim number 2 of your thesis, and this is about the translation, the research and experience into recommendations for improving the evidence. And honestly, I'm really interested in the transfer of academic work, concepts, methodologies into, let's say, the reality, how to make this come true. And therefore, I've 2 segments of questions. Number 1 is going around the situation you're facing right now. I mean, the EU is, and its organizations, institutions, and so on, is more or less, as I would like to say, a little bit fixed and has rigid structures, maybe a little bit over-bureaucratized, and trying to not to change things too fast. And you gave a lot of recommendations. My questions are, what do you think? What is the probability of the implementations of your recommendations? And how long do you think will this take? And how will you measure the process, the progress, and the success of your recommendations? Maybe you could give some words to this.
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. On the first question, which is, I think, relating to, you said chapter 2 on these regulatory science research needs and their translation into action. So the translation of evidence produced in academia into action. As I mentioned before, from a regulator's perspective, that's possible, you know, and we design this research mechanism that I mentioned to ensure that it's translated into what the scientific committees are actually producing, the guidelines they're producing, the advice they're giving, and the decisions that they're making. But that's just research that comes out of this very small regulatory science research needs initiative. And I think you were pointing to the broader point of research coming out of academia being translated into medicines regulation as a whole. The European Medicines Agency's restructuring its advice structures to have these external expert communities that are broader and that will include more academics. So that's one entry gateway that's being opened. But also in the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, at least the proposal of the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, there's provisions to consider to put more weight into evidence generated outside of the traditional routes, so outside of the randomized controlled trials submitted by medicines developers. For instance, to take evidence from the clinic, from real-world data, to adjust the indications of approved medicines, or to repurpose existing medicines. So if a medicine is approved for population X, how now the European Medicines Agency should, if provided sufficient evidence from academia, for example, from healthcare, be able to change that indication to population X plus Y if the evidence is justified. So there's a recognition that the evidence-based produced by European academia, and really European academia, are considered an absolute strength of the EU regulatory system, that it's better taken into account in the European Medicines Agency's decision, and it's better feed into the medicines that are available to patients. On your second question on the bureaucracy of the European Union, I just wanted to I won't go into that, but I just wanted to reflect that the idea of this European Evidence Ombudsman in the final chapter, I think, would have a role in ensuring that the evidence use and the evidence processes, these long processes, are as efficient as they can be, and also taking into account the previous highly esteemed opponent's question on reproducibility, to ensure that policymakers are aware of this reproducibility crisis, are aware of the hierarchy of evidence and how important that is to be aware of that. And so that any recommendations for improving the use of evidence would take into account the efficiency. In terms of the impact of these recommendations, will they ever be implemented, will they not? Part one of the chapter, when I first produced these critiques, it was we were asked to meet with the actual ombudsman, the EU ombudsman, because they were interested in this concept. They didn't take it up as an initiative, but it was good to see the interest, and Euractiv, a European media organisation, was also interested. Part two on the evidence ombudsman, the JRC colleagues reached out, and I presented to a couple of their units, because they work on evidence-based, evidence-use, evidence-informed policymaking in the EU. And then they set up a presentation to the Secretary General of the European Commission, who's in charge of better regulation, the European Union's better regulation agenda, which is its agenda to improve the use of evidence. So I was able to present that there. Unfortunately, that came after the latest revision in the better regulation agenda. So those recommendations weren't taken up, but they were taken up in a literature review that the Commission did. And so hopefully in any future revision of the better regulation agenda, they can be incorporated. And I'm not sure the European Evidence Ombudsman will ever see, this logo realised, but I think some of the recommendations produced will be implemented.
Maybe a final short question, Dr. Franken.
Okay, very short one, although we could discuss hours around this. And some of my four speakers and colleagues mentioned this question and segment as well. It's around real-world data and real-world evidence. I mean, we have different definitions of indications and so on across the European Union. Some countries are more experienced in dealing with data, medical data, pharmacological data. What do you think? How long does it take? And what would your recommendation would be to implement real-world data, real-world evidence in the decision-making across Europe?
Opponent, thank you very much for your question. It's going to take some time, and the reason why it will take some time is because, as the previous highly esteemed opponent pointed out, we have the reproducibility crisis, where even data generated in the most rigorous way faces these biases and faces these challenges of legitimacy. So we have the gold standard of randomized controlled trial, and there's a lot of resistance to moving to real-world data because that is inherently even more biased and even more uncertain. So this move is taking time. However, the European Commission and the European Agency is funding.
You can finish your sentence.
Okay, is funding an infrastructure called Darwin EU to use real-world data, real-world evidence in decision-making of the European Medicines Agency, drawing on the healthcare data that some countries have better than others, as you mentioned, Estonia, Denmark. Yeah, so it will take time, but it's moving in that direction, I think, inevitably. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Franken. Philip Hines, as the Beadle announced, the time for defending your thesis passed, which implies that the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of the defense you just did. I would ask you and your company, and also the persons online, of course, to await the results of our deliberations.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Yeah, it was easier than your practice helmet.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get in, I have a hope for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am there on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you go the extra mile a night. Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you got, go the extra mile a night. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Philip Esther Hines. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the defense you just gave. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Brandt is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, so the floor is to your supervisor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest?
Please use the hand microphone.
Independent and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer you, Philip Esther Hines, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Domine et Domini. Mihi est summa honoris et voluptatis coram vobis adesse ut laudes agam de insignibus successibus Philippi Hines in dissertatione ius doctorali. Magnae administrationis et agnitio digne sunt meritia Philippi Hines in scientis pharmaceuticis et iore unionis Europae, que hodi laudem et recognitium efflagitant. Dear Corona, oops, I guess with the text for the laudatio, I'm somehow several hundred years too late here. So let's try something different. Yo, peeps. Today, I'm here to give props and shout out to my main man, Philip Hines, for his dope PhD. This dude's academic game is over, is on fire, bringing mad skills on the fields of pharmaceutical science and EU law, and it's straight up deserving of some serious respect and recognition. Oops. I guess this modern version is too modern for this occasion. Let's try it the classical way. Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to deliver a laudatio celebrating the achievements of Mr. Philip Hines and his doctoral dissertation. Dr. Philip Hines' doctoral research delves into the relationship between evidence and the regulation of medicines within the European Union. With great determination and intellectual rigor, Philip Hines embarked on a comprehensive exploration of his complex subject, making a profound impact on our understanding of evidence-based decision-making in medicines, regulation, and legislation. The cornerstone of Mr. Hines' research lies in his investigation of the different types of evidence employed in the EU medicines regulation. Through his analysis, Mr. Hines revealed the strengths and limitations of each type of evidence, shedding light on the critical role they play in regulatory decision-making processes. Furthermore, Philipp Hines critically evaluated the legal frameworks within which evidence is generated, evaluated, and utilized in the EU. His research exposed important gaps and challenges in the current system, raising awareness about areas that require improvement. Through thoughtful analysis of case studies and engaging with key stakeholders, he proposed innovative solutions and recommendations to enhance evidence-based decision-making in medicines regulation and legislation within the European Union. By advocating for evidence-based decision-making, Mr. Hines' research offers tangible benefits for the European citizens, ensuring that the medicines they rely upon are safe, effective, and of high quality. In conclusion, I would like to extend my warmest congratulations to Mr. Philipp Hines, Dr. Hines, for his exceptional achievements and successful completion of his doctoral dissertation. And now, I must admit that this text is not mine. It was from ChatGPT. Now, so ChatGPT knows a lot about your thesis, Phil. It is indeed astonishing what this software knows about this topic. But to be honest, most of the sentences generated are general places, blah, 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 masala, and even more, little bit, masala. They don't say much specific, but they are still okay, all right. Let's us fill it now in with real life. Let's give it the human touch. Philipp, you made really best use of the situation working at the European Medicine Agency, for the agency itself, and for the academia, and also for the private family. Well, Helmut? His work at EMA generated real-world data and information that has shown to be very useful, as it offers insights and external researchers would not get otherwise. You are the second PhD at EMA I had the honor to supervise. First one was Dr. Lada Lyons, here present. The second one is you, Phil, and the third one will be Ricky Saka, who just joined EMA recently, last month. By this, you stand in the middle of a young tradition of cooperation between Maastricht University and this European institution. In April 2023, you sent me a photo of a plant located in the entrance of the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, and you asked me what plant it is. I had no clue. And then you said it was the cannabis plant. And then you told me that all the stuffs there would be pro-drug guys, and they take a very pragmatic public health approach. So you called it evidence-based drug consumption, right? And then we later agreed that we need much more grassroots trials. They would be needed. So you can imagine we also had a lot of fun all the time. Of course, you need a mentor, and at EMA, this was Marisa Papaluca, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. She had the role of the Grand Dame, giving the right advice at the right time. And by the way, I don't know who invented the wording Grand Dame. Was it you? Was it Falk? Was it Lada? But we all talk about the Grand Dame, and we know that's Marisa. So under her mentorship, and of course, your lovely wife's influence, Joe's, your support all over the time, Philipp grew to a real gentleman during his PhD. And look how he is dressed today. He's not dressed so colorful as a Sapeurs, the gentleman of Bukango, but with his winning and colorful character, he managed all the hurdles during his PhD journey par excellence. So these are the Sapeurs. Society for Advancements of People of Elegance. Dear Philip, dear Phil, it was so exciting time working with you on your PhD. Welcome now on the board. Sorry. Welcome now to the friends group of the international and wonderful PhD alumni family. I know that the next journey will lead you to IQVIA, so there are also some family and friends, I guess. And of course, we hope that you will help others to reach a PhD too. Cordially, congratulations once again, also on behalf of Marisa and of Timo. And here, the sapeurs to even get more elegance, dear gentlemen. Congratulations.
Dear Dr. Hines, also on behalf of the academic community here in Maastricht, I would like to congratulate you with this distinction. I must say I enjoyed this ceremony. I'm present at many ceremonies, as you might expect, and sometimes, you know, I really get nervous myself. I didn't see any nerves today, which is a bit amazing to me. I would extend the congratulations, of course, to the partner Joe, or Yo, or I don't know which nationality you are. And of course to the supervising team. I must say it's important work, because the relation between science, evidence, practice, policy, regulation is, I think, of importance to anybody in the field of medicine, but also in other sciences, and even for, you know, a simple emeritus professor in health promotion, it's really relevant, so thank you for that. I quickly went through the CV. You're based in London, which of course is a bit unfortunate when Ime is going to Amsterdam, which means a lot of traveling, probably. But then I also read that you are used to doing 3,000 kilometers of cycling, although this has been 13 years ago. Cycling from London to Amsterdam is really, you know, a problem, because you need quite a lot of oxygen in your mask, of course. That's just a joke to make it a bit informal, because now we will go to the more informal part, only after I have thanked all the opponents present here, but also the one online, of course. Thank you for joining us from Cologne. And I would like to thank the audience, both here and online, for their attendance to this ceremony, and thereby I close this ceremony. And after I've closed it, the online connection goes down, but that gives so that's now, because now he can say anything he wants, Dr. Franken.
Yeah, first of all, congrats. Very impressive work. And I heard you go to IQVIA, which will be the next steps in your career. I mean, this is a